talk a little bit about how what is solidarity to you?
Hello, my name is Simone. You met me before. I'm from the Ngunnawal community northwest of South Australia. I've lived on Katerina country all my life, but gone back to country all my life. So this big question of solidarity really made me have to reflect and think back of my work within the academy with my fellow colleagues for over 2 decades. And in a sense, I grew up in the academy as well. But the first thing I want to say before I sort of answer that is, for me to engage in a process of solidarity is to honour my first teachers. And so my first teachers, many of the women that I've lost in the past, including my late mother, Futuru, but many women from the Kupapiti Konkudura, and Kupapiti means Kupapiti, and Konka means women, and Jura means many, and that's the many women from Kupapiti. And what these senior knowledge holders undertook was the importance of protection of country. And it's my first teachers to talk about that responsibility of the country. And in that, these very senior women, many who are no longer with us, fought against the proposals of waste repositories and dumps within distant country in South Australia, so they are anti-nuclear campaigners. And what they have taught me, and it is always the first philosophical position that informs everything I do within my personal life, my public life and my professional life, is to speak with humility, to stand strong, but to talk straight and talk out when you need to. And these senior women had such a strong sense of generosity, because their fight to protect country was a fight for all people. They saw beyond themselves, but understood their very specific, localised responsibility to our country, but also the impact what that might mean nationally and internationally when we think about the impact of radiation. So in a sense, that's my first premise of learning from my community what solidarity is. And that is speaking out and speaking strong. In that, I think the first things that university needs to do is acknowledge and understand that when Indigenous peoples welcome you to country, they are actually enacting their sovereignty, and that can never be taken, no matter how anyone looks at that or critiques that. And so, in that process, it means the university has to reflect on its role of colonialism. And in doing that, in that process of truth-telling, that is the beginning to build reciprocal relationships, to form solidarity within the academy, between scholars, with students, and to form those communities within an institution. And I think something that we've done in these last few days is actually talk about the importance of connecting with Indigenous scholars locally, nationally, but within the Pacific and internationally as well. So in that sense, that solidarity means that you can sit in front of people and talk strong and talk about uncomfortable things. And as Donna Haraway would say, staying with the trouble and having those hard conversations, but working towards something that is a future far bigger than any one of us, or any one individual in this room. So I think for me, solidarity is a call for a different type of leadership. And I think that different type of leadership needs to recognise the wisdom of Indigenous communities and collective knowledge and collective ownership and responsibility. Because I couldn't sit here without that collective support and in that humility of leadership. And knowing when I need to step up and knowing when I need to step back.
Good morning. It's actually afternoon, isn't it? No, it's still morning. My name is Lisa Hilli. I am a Ngunnawal Tolai woman from Papua New Guinea, with lineages that also reach back to Finland, England, and South Africa. I think being this idea of solidarity is through actions. It's allowing someone to speak first on a panel. It's hearing Alice advocate for more Indigenous scholars to be awarded ARC grants. It's those small actions that amount to so much more, and that's something I've learned to do as an artist and also as a music professional working at Museums Victoria. It's acknowledging the silences that I get. It's being conscious of my behaviour on lands that were stolen that I've had the privilege to benefit from through my father's history. It's small gestures, and it's subtle, and I think it's just being really conscious of how Indigenous people behave towards you, around you, and directly towards you. So solidarity for me is being a good ally as a Saltwater woman, as a woman of the Pacific, a woman of the ocean, a woman of Natar in my language.
Hi, my name is Futuru, from Taiwan. Actually, my situation is really complicated. I'm the only one who was not born in an English context area. So if you don't understand my English, please feel me. Yeah, that's the only way. Okay. Currently I teach at a university in southern East Taiwan, National Taitung University. That's really remote. I think the remotest university in Taiwan. And the city around the campus is 1/3 of population are Indigenous peoples. But my university before was a teachers' college. They basically only try to teach Indigenous people how to fit the modern world. They don't really care about Indigenous situation. But recently, 10 years, in these 10 years, my university tried to transform to be a real university. And the society and also the Taiwanese government try to ask us, the university, okay, you're a university, you got knowledge, you got tech knowledge. Okay, please help Indigenous community around your university. But since happened that we discussed to this before that for me it's kind of re-colonization. Or maybe a micro-colonization. You're thinking doing something good, but actually you don't know anything about the Indigenous people community and the philosophy and how they survive during the historical context. So actually, that's the situation for my university. But for myself, I'm also complicated. Actually, when Katerina emailed me to invite me here, that okay, we're going to talk about Indigenous scholars, how Indigenous scholars decolonize the academy. Okay, I replied to Katerina that said, are you sure I'm fit your qualification? Because in Taiwan, it's really political situation. If you claim yourself as a Indigenous people, you must have legally represented. You have that kind of ID. Legally represented, and then you got some political rights. You only have the legislature. You can only vote for Indigenous legislature. You cannot vote for Chinese or Taiwanese legislature. So that's kind of separation. And also there's some financial aid, something like that. And so it's kind of political, controversial situation in Taiwan. So although I know I have from my grandmother genealogy, I have 5 generations ago, I have Indigenous, genealogy, but I was raised as a Hakka people before 25 years ago, before my age 20 years old. And 25 years ago, I decided to ride my bicycle from the north of Taiwan to all the way around Taiwan. I stopped in Taitung. And I just stuck in there. And 25 years ago, and later I went to work for a semiconductor factory, much better paid than as a teacher, a professor in university. I quit my job. I want to stay, I want to live in Taitung. It's kind of alternative lifestyle. Then I find anthropology past the discipline I can learn because it's field work. Okay, I can go field, stay there, live there. So I live in the village right now. After I got a PhD, I live in the village right now. And I was forced to be the executive secretary of the village for 5 years. And that's really complicated. I was forced. Because I 25 years ago, I didn't know anything about. One day I was sitting here talking about indigenous approach to decolonize academy. 25 years ago, it's kind of when Katerina told me that probably it's kind of spirit calling. It's kind of 5 generations ago, the spirit of my grandmother's genealogy make me do this all the way. So back to the university situation. So my situation is kind of complicated. So back to the university situation. So I become a bridge because everybody believe me I'm sort of indigenous people, indigenous scholar. So from a university, okay, you know indigenous people, so you can be the bridge. You do the research, you do the project. And from the community indigenous people, okay, you are the scholar, you got a better payment, you got a better prestige, so you have to do something for us. So it's kind of between the bridge. So I'm bridge between the university and the community. So for me, solidarity. Yeah, I can never pronounce it correctly. Solidarity. For me, it's kind of, I try to, because I live in a community, my wife, my son, my house, my life, I'm going to die over there anyway. And I built up a really intimate relationship with my land and the ocean. You can see this, I'm also a spear fisherman, free diving, because it's our tradition. I built up some kind of intimacy with the ocean. And I have to do that. And also, in the university, I also teach filmmaking. I believe filmmaking as a way to, it's an indigenous way. Because filmmaking always focus on teamwork, collectively. And in indigenous community, there's no me, you, or him individually. It's always us, or always together, doing things together. And filmmaking is kind of a way to do something. We can build up solidarity. Solidarity. Okay, yeah, that's my strategy. I was doing. So I made many documentary, short films, even music video, and any kind of film works that I'm trying to explore. Although those are no credits in academic.
Exactly. Which is something else that we've been talking about across the last couple of days. A lot of us have a creative practice that exists alongside our proper research or our traditional outputs, and it is actually our creative practice that saves us within the academy, that keeps us there. So I always liked, the kind of interesting work that you're doing, as well as being that bridge. But also we talked a lot about this idea of being called. For many of us in the group, we were brought into the academy not because we had some idea of, I would like to be an academic, that sounds fabulous. That's not how many of us get into the academy, and it certainly wasn't the way I got into the academy. I followed my sister. It was very much about following family. But in terms of solidarity, one of the things that's absolutely vital for the survival of the Barnabin people, which is my father's people who were displaced from Kiribati to Fiji is you will not survive in the new land of Fiji if you do not build solidarities with others. So we are displaced from Kiribati to Fiji because of Australian, New Zealand and British phosphate mining, which took the land and used it as fertilizer to be spread across Australia and New Zealand and elsewhere. And so we had to go into creative survival mode in order to be able to thrive and recreate culture in a new land. And we sort of exist in these spaces between Kiribati and Fiji and a broader Banaban diaspora. So Banabans work with Fijians, they work with the Tuvaluans who live across the way, who were displaced from Tuvalu, who live on Kioa. They work with Indo-Fijians. There are a lot of Banabans who have intermarried so that they can have access to a whole range of other resources, because if you don't do that, you won't survive. So I feel like solidarity is something that Banabans have had to learn by being displaced Indigenous peoples, and it's definitely something that has deeply shaped my work as well.
And just building off of those ideas around solidarity, I was wondering, who is solidarity between? Because I think you've all touched on different ideas of who is actually involved in this relationship. So who is solidarity between, and what are the strategies for enabling solidarity, and what are some of the barriers that you see?
So barriers of solidarity and strategies. Who is, what is it? I'll speak from a museum context, and I also just want to add a disclaimer that, you know, I am a public servant, and so I am actually limited in what I can say in these public forums, which I hate. So I have to be very careful, particularly as this is being live streamed. Solidarity for me in the museum is always with First Peoples. I recently got allocated into the First Peoples department, which was made a year ago under the new restructure of the new CEO that came in, and I wasn't sure, I didn't necessarily feel 100% comfortable about that, but then I realised that First Peoples in the museum needed support of Pacific people, and so it was a matter of a numbers game and ensuring that we were able to support them to ensure that they got power in the museum space. And so myself and another Pacific person were put into that department, and we supported First Peoples' I guess needs and wants for having a strategy that now is basically at the core of everything we do, and that is that we place First Peoples' knowledge, culture and histories at the centre of everything that we do in the museum now, and that's been incredible. It's been amazing, but it's also come with challenges in that, you know, there's limited numbers. There's only like eight First Peoples in the department, and you know, you've got 400 staff, and so everyone's drawing upon us to get everything, and ensure that there's First Peoples stories or cultural knowledge or history within every single thing we do, and it's not an easy task. And so I actually freaked out a little bit when I first thought, when the idea was first tabled with us, and I just thought, oh my god, we're going to have to do all the work, you know, and we are. And I've been seconded out of First Peoples because I'm working on the redevelopment of the New Pacific Gallery at Melbourne Museum, so I feel like I've got a dream job there, but I want to also ensure that, you know, I'm still in solidarity with First Peoples of the land, but also within the museum context, that we ensure, we acknowledge that that gallery and the objects that have come from our homelands are still on Wurundjeri lands, and so that there is always going to be acknowledgement or a show, or stories that sort of somehow show those trans-Indigenous relationships that we have with First Peoples. So I think we'll just leave it there for now. Yeah.
My situation is that in my community we have that kind of age organization for Amis people. So every 5 years, all the boys after 12 years old, you had to attend age organization. So in the same age set, everyone should be brother and sisters. and lifelong. So we don't have only one mother or only one father. We have plenty fathers and plenty mothers in the community. But this kind of system was almost disappeared 25 years ago. And in these 25 years, recently, we're going to try to build up the next generation, to educate our next generation in the community, to reform the age organization. So it becomes the base of solidarity of the community. So we can do something, negotiate with the government and to argue with the university. You don't do something you want to do, you should stay with big friend first. Not in the beginning just try to help us without knowing anything. But inside the community, in my village, we still practicing hunting and spearfishing, also weaving, because those kind of, we call it traditional knowledge or traditional skills. It's not only a hunting or fishing per se. It's the way to build up, especially, for example, for hunting, you have to do it collectively. It's dangerous. And also spearfishing underwater, free diving spearfishing, is also dangerous. You have to rely on each other's the life. You have to rely on each other's. So it built up a solidarity. So based on this kind of indigenous community solidarity, as a scholar, I also attended this kind of HSET. I have to do my duty, and I reverse this kind of power, go back into the university, and also go back to the government. So the indigenous community has become a subject, not always an object.
Yeah.
I think from my perspective, building solidarity occurs at multiple ways. I don't think there's one way necessarily. From a personal context, maintaining my kinship connections with my family and my responsibilities is the fundamental way of knowing and being and doing that I continue to connect with, and that does enter into my professional context. And that occurs in the way when you may be asked by your members of your community to step up and talk, even when you feel perhaps not quite ready. Or the context, like a Royal Commission, becomes very overwhelming. So a couple of years back, I'm part of the Untitled Native Title Corporation, which is our community native title corporation, and we had a Royal Commission into the nuclear cycle in South Australia. It was called by our state premier, the previous Labor Premier, Tsai, and that was to look into a number of things, but lo and behold, the one area that they decided to explore as a consequence of public consultation and expert advice was not, it was focused particularly on waste repositories and building waste dumps in South Australia. And so it was no surprise that that was the focus of South Australia again in relation to nuclear repositories. And so one of my sisters, my Ngunnawal, Katerina Lester, who I need to acknowledge, and my sister Rose Lester, who were the daughter of the late Ngambri Lester, who was my uncle, my Ngunnawal, who spoke really strongly about the effects of Maralenga, and you would have seen in the little image that we had, images of the bomb, and that's about the reference to the impact of radiation and the ongoing intergenerational impacts of that, but also radioactive ideas. How do we deal with those ideas? Where are the spaces where we have those difficult conversations around those ideas that are violent and are radioactive? And so part of that solidarity with my own community, and it actually, solidarity probably isn't the right word for my community connection. It is actually my connectedness, my relationality, my belonging, my responsibility was to step up and participate with my two sisters in relation to that Royal Commission. So that's where I feel my professional work, the teachings from my first knowledge holders, and my skill within the university to be able to talk and present was able to benefit my community as well, and in effect benefit me in terms of keeping strong, because I'm living out of country. In terms of senior leadership, I've been the director of the Indigenous Centre, and I'm currently acting Pro-Vice Chancellor Indigenous with my colleague Ali. There's a different set of requirements, and that is actually sitting at the table with senior leadership, which often can be are not a familiar place to be in. And so what I mentioned at the beginning about solidarity in relation to leadership, for me, I think having creative forms of leadership, when sitting at the table, having those difficult conversations about racism in the academy, about really what does it mean to make decolonising policy, what does it look like, is it achievable, where are the spaces where there are greater possibilities, so finding the spaces of possibilities for solidarity become part of that conversation. And so part of that process of engaging in solidarity, I think, for the institution and for non-Indigenous scholars and workers within the university, is actually about going through a process of positioning yourself, allocating yourself, and going through your own decolonisation process. And I'm not saying we all shouldn't do that, I think we all need to go through that process, but particularly thinking about what does that mean when I articulate my own position and location, because we do it all the time. It is how we connect ourselves. And that's a thoughtful process, and it requires deep thinking and deep listening. And it also, as I mentioned before, requires sometimes stepping back as well, and allowing for black space, because sometimes we need our black spaces, and sometimes we need to be with our critical colleagues as well. And so finding, again, I refer to Haraway in terms of like-mindedness, people that you can connect with. And that's one of the things the Kipipiti Kukudura did. In their fight against the South Australian government, which they won in relation to that particular waste up proposal, they made strategic partnerships. They found the like-minded thinkers who wanted to protect country, protect environment, and protect the future of all Australians. And so finding those critical people become part of that process. And in that process also be able to have difference of opinions, but a collective vision, because we need to have these discussions. And that's why I think having the hard conversations is really important. But the solidarity that I really love is working with students. I mean, I get so much. I've taught students for 21 years, and our students don't enter the room as empty vessels. No. In fact, our kids don't enter the rooms as empty vessels. They come in with a world of knowledge. And when an educator can see that their knowledge is, we're an expert in a particular field, if that's what you want to call it, but we also have many bodies in the room who embody their own knowledges. And when we can actually shift that thinking and not just see ourselves only as always the expert, then that's where I think really strong learning can occur. So that's kind of how I see the different mechanisms of solidarity, or what I probably would call collectivity.
I think I might talk a bit about the challenges. And I think there are a lot of challenges at ANU. I'm a product of ANU. I came here in 1999 to do my PhD, and so I've observed this space for a long time, and I've been in this space, and of course I've benefited from this space. You know, we're all privileged scholars here, but there's also quite a consistent kind of feeling or expectation when you come out of this space that you ought to be grateful. So please make sure you're good native who's also grateful for the opportunities that have been given you. Don't bite the hands that feed you. So for me, something like that is definitely a barrier to building real solidarity. And similar to what we were talking about in the previous panel, you will never really know us if that's your attitude. I think Indigenous people, Pacific people, all people have a right to the institution and to education and to the opportunities that it brings. And I think a lot of us have done well and survived here off our own creativity and our own really, really hard work. So a lot of the barriers I see have to do with assumptions around hierarchy and who controls things, who has the real power. and people thinking they don't have power. There's a lot of, like academics who are like, oh my God, I don't really have like power. I don't actually influence things out there. But they do, similar to what Alice was, talking about, the kind of work that you do. It is actually important. It's not like literature is less than policy, for example. So there is power when it comes to knowledge. There's power in knowledge production. There's power in controlling research and research grants. There's power in, being the editor of the book, in being the author of the book. This is all power. And I think it's really, really important that we learn from the beginning about how this power actually operates, how these structures of power look, and therefore how to navigate it. Because I think we all come into the institution from different backgrounds and pathways and contexts, but nobody really tells you how power works. Nobody really tells you about the architecture of the power and how it operates in the university, so that even when there are people who think they're doing good work and they're the good ones, and then maybe those are the bad ones, like as if bad colonizers have a particular kind of look and good people look different. That is actually not how structural power operates. So I think literacy and knowledge of how that operates and acknowledge of people's positionalities and the way in which they possess and they wield power allows you to examine yourself better and build better solidarities with others. So another thing we've been talking a lot about is how Indigenous peoples enter a space and then we all kind of scramble around for the crumbs and we end up competing with each other, or we end up becoming gatekeepers ourselves and not being generous and inclusive for others. And there are a lot of silos at ANU. It is not easy for Pacific people to have conversations with Indigenous people, not because we don't want to, but because of the way in which this university has been designed, with lots of gatekeeping and lots of funding structures and lots of ticking the boxes and lots of people protecting, their power, which separates people and prevents them from building the kind of solidarities that we desperately need to build, not just for the political action that we need to do, and there's a ton of that, there's a ton of political work, but for the well-being, for the collective care, which is another topic that we've been constantly talking about in this workshop, like when you can find your sisters, when you can make black spaces, and black spaces are hard to carve out at ANU. I think our Aboriginal students have done an amazing job to be able to do that, but everybody else is often in a silo, and often those silos are competing with each other in quite intense ways. So I guess I want to highlight is there are a lot of structural barriers to building real solidarity and to having the difficult conversations, because often people don't want to examine their positionality and ask themselves the hard question about how they benefit from the kind of power that exists in the university.
And just adding on from what Katerina said, positive solidarity is, I guess just the workshop that we've done over the last 2.5 days that you created, Katerina, has been like, that's solidarity to me. Like, that's just carved out a space for all of us who've participated to create solidarity. Like, it's been amazing. So thank you so much for that. And again, I'm going to reference Uncle Wally. That Welcome to Country was just incredible. I've always known ANU as to be this kind of constructed space or constructed institution, which I kind of was like, what is it? And we were having these questions of like, what is the ANU? Is it the people? Is it the students? Or is it is it the chancellors? Like, nobody could actually say what is the university. And I feel like Uncle Wally just nailed that. And something I took away from his Welcome to Country and actually explaining it to us, the significance of places and food and culture and waterways and the memories of waterways, was about being a good host, so that you come back. And and that's something that I think about as with my institution hat on, is we want to make sure communities always come back to the museum. Do you want to ensure that, as ANU, as a collective body, an institution, do you want to ensure that Indigenous people feel safe here? Do you want to ensure that they can always want to come back and feel like they belong here? And I think, part of that is thinking about, not just ANU, which is like, if you think about the Australian National University, like that's a big title. It's a huge title, and it should be the benchmark for all universities across the whole nation. And it led me to think about this question, which is, do you want to see Indigenous people thrive? Is that what that's what I want to see. And I keep thinking about that question, even this morning when I was getting ready. I don't feel comfortable with this title of being Australian. I never feel comfortable with it. It's like putting on like this itchy shirt, and it's like, take it off. It's like, I don't feel comfortable with it because Indigenous people aren't thriving in this country. And if you want to see Indigenous people thrive, then we have to relinquish power. We have to let go. You have to shift, you have to make space.
Make space.
You have to make space, and that's something I'm trying to do every single day, even as a black woman. That's what it's about. It's just relinquishing power. And maybe there needs to be scaffolding or like some 10, 20-year long-term plan that the institution has to do to actually implement. Okay, put it in the job description. If you're going to take up this senior position, there has to be something in that job description that says you must mentor an Indigenous person to take on your job or to fill in that space. And that's what it's about. They're the small mechanisms that need to happen. It's in those little fine print things, across everything. That's how you get it in, and that's how you make that change. That doesn't have to be like, okay, hand it over now. It's just like gradual, okay? Because the last thing you want to do is just hand over jobs or like these big positions that are designed, we set Indigenous people up to fail, because then it proves, like, they can't handle it, they can't do it. And then it becomes tokenism, because I see that happening in my institution, putting brown people in spaces that aren't actually true leaders. They don't have the qualifications, and they're failing. And it's really, really sad to see. And, then we end up having to do a lot of heavy lifting for our own people inside the institutions. So, relinquishing space.
Absolutely.
Thanks, everyone. I think you've really covered a lot of ground with your answers. And I think we're close to finishing up. But one thing that we were talking about yesterday is there a message or a text that you'd like to leave the audience with? And a text could be anything, it doesn't have to be.
Thank you. I've said my message probably a few times, and it comes from the teachings of the Cooper Pedicle Moderator, and that is talking straight and staying strong.
I've just got some notes here that say ways to decolonize, because that's what we've largely been talking about, that big D word. Sorry. I'm taking it from I always try and think about decolonisation from a personal perspective, because I think people get lost in the whole big sort of framework of like decolonising institution, because it's like nobody knows what it is. It's like, is it the structure? Like, what is it? It needs to start here, like first, like inside, heart, mind. Like that's where it starts, and then you can go out. So I'm in the process of actually trying to understand my own father's family history. My great-grandfather was an Englishman, a very violent man towards his South African coloured wife. Bought land, stolen land from Wurundjeri people in the Yarra Valley. I've only just found that out. And so that's some dark truths that I'm actually working through right now. So I'm actually having a conversation with a Wurundjeri woman that I used to work with, and that's really confronting. And so it's having those really hard, difficult conversations